All right, today we're diving into a battle that, wasn't the biggest or even the bloodiest of World War I, but it was one that completely rewrote the rulebook. We're talking about Cambrai, 1917. This is the story of how one battle broke an impossible deadlock and created a terrifying blueprint for the future of war. So, to really get this, you have to picture the scene. It's late 1917. For 3 long, brutal years, World War I has just been stuck. The world's most powerful armies are trapped in this absolute hellscape of trenches, endless barbed wire and machine guns, and for every single commander, there's only one question that matters. How on earth do you break through this? Well, for years, the answer was always the same. More. More men, more artillery shells. You look at battles like Passchendaele, my gosh, hundreds of thousands of casualties. For what? Gains measured in yards. The front line was just this static, blood-soaked nightmare of fortifications that seemed completely, utterly unbreakable. Every conventional tactic had been tried, and every single one had failed, just spectacularly and so tragically. Okay, but there was this new piece of tech on the battlefield, the tank. I mean, this thing was literally designed to solve the problem, to cross trenches, to crush barbed wire. But the results so far? Kinda underwhelming, to be honest. They'd been used in these small, piecemeal attacks. They broke down all the time, and they'd never really made a big difference. So you've got this incredible new machine, but nobody had figured out the right way to use it. And here it is, the Mark IV. This was the latest and greatest British tank. Just look at that classic rhomboid shape. That was designed specifically to get it across those super wide German trenches. It was heavily armed and built to just crawl its way through the horrors of no man's land. This was the tool that British commanders were praying could finally crack the Hindenburg Line. But see, it's one thing to have a new weapon. It's another thing to have a new plan. To really unlock the tank's potential, you needed a new kind of thinking. And that thinking came from this guy, Colonel J.F.C. Fuller. He was the chief of staff for the British Tank Corps. And he wasn't just some stuffy officer. He was a meticulous, brilliant planner who saw the tank not just as some infantry support vehicle. No, he saw it as the key to an entirely new way of waging war. Okay, so we have to talk about Fuller himself, because he's a really complicated figure. As a military mind, the man was an absolute genius, a visionary. His ideas on mechanized warfare were studied by armies all over the globe. But, and this is a big but, it's also a historical fact that after his army career, he got involved with British fascist movements and had some pretty awful pro-Nazi sympathies. Now, for what we're talking about today, we're focused squarely on his pivotal military role at Cambrai. It's really important that you get the whole complicated picture of the man. So Fuller's plan for Cambrai, it was revolutionary. Why? Because it wasn't just about, hey, let's throw a bunch of tanks at the Germans and see what happens. No way. This was a finely tuned, carefully synchronized operation, and it was all built on 3 core principles that, if he could pull them all off at once, would be absolutely devastating. And what were those 3 keys? It was all about getting 3 things perfectly right. First, favorable terrain. Second, an overwhelming mass of force. And third, total, complete surprise. Get one of them wrong, and the whole thing fails. This was so different from the grinding, attritional battles they'd been fighting for years. Okay, let's break that down. Key number 1, terrain. Fuller and his team specifically chose the sector near Cambrai because the ground was chalky, firm, and rolling. In other words, perfect for tanks. But here's the really clever part. They deliberately avoided the usual days-long artillery bombardment. You know why? Because that would have just turned the whole battlefield into a muddy, cratered moonscape that the tanks would get stuck in. Instead, the plan was for a short, intense barrage right before the attack, keeping the ground intact as a key advantage. Key number 2, mass. We're not talking about a handful of tanks helping out the infantry here. Oh no, this was going to be a tank assault. They gathered the entire strength of the British Tank Corps, 378 brand new Mark IV tanks, all ready to lead the charge. The infantry? Their job was to follow the tanks. This was a scale of armored warfare nobody had ever even dreamed of before. And finally, key number 3, surprise. And man, the lengths they went to for this were incredible. The tanks were only moved up to their starting positions at night, engines running to cover the noise of their tracks. They built dummy tanks in other areas to throw off German intelligence. Get this? Even their own infantry didn't know the full plan until the very last second. And remember that short artillery barrage? That meant the Germans had no warning. And as if that wasn't enough, on the morning of the attack, a thick mist rolled in, giving them the perfect natural camouflage. It was just perfect. So the stage is set. You've got the right terrain. You've got the massed force. And the enemy has absolutely no idea what's about to hit them. At 6:20 a.m. on November 20th, 1917, the whistles blow, the engines roar to life, and the future of warfare arrives. And this wasn't just a mad dash. The tanks moved forward in these really well-organized little teams of 3. Each team had what they called a male tank, which was armed with 2 heavy cannons, and then 2 female tanks, which were just bristling with machine guns. Think of it like a tiny, self-contained little battle group, with the male tank for punching holes and the females for spraying down enemy infantry. And they had this absolutely brilliant, almost choreographed way of dealing with the massive German trenches. So check this out. As the team got to a trench, the lead male tank would pivot and fire its cannons right down the length of it, just clearing out any defenders. Then, one of the female tanks would drive right up to the edge and drop this huge bundle of wood, they called it a fascine, right into the trench. And just like that, the tank could use it as a makeshift bridge to cross over. They just repeated this process for trench after trench. It was simple, it was brutal, and man, was it effective. The result? It was spectacular. The German defenders were just sitting there, expecting the usual long bombardment, when suddenly hundreds of these steel monsters just loomed out of the mist. They were completely overrun. In some places, the British advanced 5 miles in a single day. Now, you have to understand, 5 miles. At Passchendaele, a similar gain took 3 months and cost over 200,000 lives. This was a different kind of war. But that incredible, mind-blowing success on day 1, well, that wasn't the end of the story. You see, Cambrai is famous for its breakthrough, yeah, but it's just as famous for what happened next. That incredible momentum just fizzled out, almost as quickly as it had appeared. So what went wrong? Well, the problem was, the planners had focused so much on making the breakthrough, they hadn't really planned for what to do after the breakthrough. It's like kicking down a door and then just standing there. There were no major reserves, no fresh infantry, no more tanks, ready to flood through the gap they had created. The cavalry units that were supposed to do this job were way too far behind and just couldn't keep up. They had punched this massive hole in the German line, but there was nobody to go through it. And on top of that, the tanks themselves were getting hammered. I mean, look at these numbers. It's incredible. They started with 378 tanks on day 1. By day 2, only 199 were still operational. That's almost half of them gone, from a mix of enemy fire and just mechanical breakdowns. By the time the Germans launched their big counterattack, the British had fewer than 100 tanks left. Their key advantage, that massive force, had just evaporated. So, with their mass gone and the element of surprise obviously gone, the battle just bogged down. It turned back into that familiar, grinding infantry fight they'd been trying to escape. German reinforcements rushed in, and on November 30th, they launched a huge counterattack. And using some new, clever infiltration tactics of their own, they pushed the British back, taking back about half the ground that had been won so spectacularly just days before. So you have to ask, was Cambrai a victory or a defeat? And the truth is, it's not that simple. It really ended up as what historians call a successful failure. It was a battle where the most important outcome wasn't about the territory gained or lost, but about the incredibly powerful lessons it taught absolutely everyone. So what were those lessons? Well, for the Allies, Cambrai was proof of concept. It showed that massed tank attacks could work, and it kicked off a race to design even better, faster tanks. But for the Germans, man, it was a terrifying wake-up call. They immediately started working on better anti-tank weapons, sure, but more importantly, their smartest officers started studying what Fuller had done, not just to figure out how to stop it, but how to do it themselves. And this right here is probably the most important legacy of the whole battle. There was this young German officer at the time named Heinz Guderian. You might have heard of him. He became the architect of the Blitzkrieg in World War II. Well, he studied Fuller's ideas and the tactics from Cambrai absolutely obsessively. He saw exactly how that combination of mass, surprise, and mechanized power could shatter a defense. The first tank blitzkrieg at Cambrai became the direct inspiration for the blitzkriegs that would tear across Europe just 2 decades later. And that brings us to the big final question, doesn't it? The battle itself kind of fizzled out into a stalemate, but the ideas it unleashed, the concept of a fast, mechanized, combined arms breakthrough, that was unstoppable. So it really makes you think, could it be that this messy, flawed, half-won battle was actually the most important and far-reaching lesson of the entire First World War?